Good afternoon all and welcome to this month's Certainty Expert webinar. I'm Mark Cox here at Certainty, the National Will Register. Many of you are aware and use the Certainty Will Search service to search for missing, unknown or indeed later wills. Certainty Will Search does not just search the register, which currently stands at over 8.5 million wills. It searches for wills in areas where the deceased used to live or work throughout the UK, including Scotland and Northern Ireland, including from professional will writers, from IPW, IPWS and SWW, and its storage facilities such as the National Will Archives and National Will Safe. We are delighted to introduce Gill, who is presenting this next Certainty Expert webinar titled, What Would You Charge for a Will if Wills and LPAs were the only services you offered? A solicitor of high standing in the legal community, Gill has earned considerable respect as a knowledgeable and compelling conference speaker with regular engagements throughout England and Wales. Backed by her own experiences in and for private client departments, Gill identifies with the everyday challenges that professionals face, enabling her to provide learning and development opportunities that inspire them to develop the expertise they need to deliver commitments competently to their clients. She is a member of the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, UK Practice Committee and the Association of Taxation Technicians. Should you have any questions, do type the question into the comments box and let us know who you are and where you are from. Gill will attempt to answer as many questions as possible at the end of this Certainty Expert webinar, time permitting of course. Gill, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, hopefully my slides will appear shortly. So this webinar is set against the backdrop that the regulatory framework for legal services, which was set up under the Legal Services Act, is in need of review. There are definitely mixed feelings out there about whether more change is necessary, but generally the framework should serve to protect the vulnerable and the public consumer. Is it right that currently if you cannot afford a lawyer, then you are left to your own devices? Of course, government has a role here with the diminishing returns from legal aid. The challenge for the regulators and the professional bodies is whether there should be more change, which is radical, or whether any change should be incremental in approach. Change, however, does seem to be on the cards. The Competition and Markets Authority conducted a survey of the legal services market in 2016, and the main issues for them include consumer protection and the ability of consumers to assess the value between competing providers. As you know, one outcome of this was the move to price transparency, which for private client practitioners was transparency on probate fees. The CMA's experience has shown them that although progress has been made, more needs to be done. There is not, in their view, sufficient targeting of risks, and there is a very genuine lack of public understanding. The CMA are itching to review the England and Wales market again, and will drafting will, in my view, be in their sights. They may yet prove to be helpful to us in encouraging the government to regulate will writing, given they were supportive of this before. But they clearly are interested in the price of a standard will and how this price could be lowered through the use of IT. So really trying to keep up to date and know what's coming, these are the sort of things you can find by signing up for my monthly digest, and obviously today is part of this story. So, as was said at the beginning, my aim in this webinar is to basically engage with you in exercising and rethinking the pricing of a will service in competitive times. And as a result, participants, I hope, will reflect on their own practice and maybe even look at some aspects of it differently. To achieve our aim, I have divided this session into 6 parts. These include how many chargeable hours are taken in making a standard will, what are the variables regarding profits, and is there enough potential business available in your area to achieve the sort of profits we need? How many chargeable hours could be taken in add-on services that might make the will drafting service more viable, such as making lasting powers of attorney or estate planning? And then let's look at the reality check of what the world around you is doing. And I hope at the end, perhaps through your questions, we can think about what you will do next. I hope you'll reflect on that, obviously. So let's get us started then, and just let's mention a very dirty word, profit. So what is your target profit? I'm going to make a few comments here. I think most firms would be highly delighted to achieve a net profit margin of 25%. And certainly from talking to many of you, I think a lot of you do not achieve that. A net profit margin is important because it tells us the amount of net profit per £1 of turnover a business has earned. So if we know we need to make a certain amount of profit to make it worthwhile being in business, then from that we can extrapolate how much turnover, how much business coming in we actually need. So, for example, to have a net profit of £100,000 with a net profit margin of 25%, we'd have to turn over £400,000. If we want more net profit, we'd have to increase the turnover. If our profit margin was narrower, we'd have to increase the turnover. So in order to be able to get our business on the right footing, we do have to talk about profits, and we do therefore have to extrapolate from that what our turnover needs to be. So my question would be, if we just take that as a benchmark, £100,000 of profit with a 25% profit margin and a turnover of 400,000, can we actually achieve that doing will writing alone? So what I want to examine is the problems of achieving profits when all you're doing is drafting wills the way we do now, and maybe something has to give. Something which you should always ask yourself when you're dealing with any fixed fee business service is how many chargeable hours are going to be taken in doing this service. So in our case, we're talking about wills. But if you don't think about the amount of time you're regularly spending, then clearly if you're budgeting your profits based on chargeable hours, but then you're not charging your chargeable hours out at your profit level, then basically you're not going to hit that profit. So effectively budgeting for so many chargeable hours at so many pounds per hour, but then saying, oh, I'm going to provide this service for a fixed fee. If that fixed fee doesn't represent how many chargeable hours it takes you to do the job, then your profit margin will be hit, your profits won't be met. And so just because you've got fixed fees, you shouldn't stop. You shouldn't stop recording your chargeable hours. You need to record them to know if you're still on target. So to examine profit from wills alone, we do need to do some what I would call quick and dirty numbers. So to do that, I've made some assumptions. Let's assume that you only write wills, that it takes you 2 hours on average of chargeable time to take a new client through the process from beginning to end, that you charge a fixed fee for doing this of £300, and that you don't charge for home visits. So on that basis, we would need to achieve our net target for profit of 25% on a fixed fee of £300. We'd actually have to see 1,333 clients over the course of a year. Really? How did I get to that figure? Well, let's look at chargeable hours, as I've said. Normally, law firms work on the basis that our full-time fee-earning person will achieve 1,200 chargeable hours a year. So most firms budget their business around 1,200 chargeable hours a year for each full-time fee earner. Now this works out at 5 chargeable hours per working day over 48 weeks. So it gives us some holiday, it gives us the fact that we don't work at weekends, ha. So since the average working day is 7 hours, this gives us 2 magnificent hours per day for non-chargeable activity. So administration, marketing, etc. Now, I know in reality many of us spend far more than 2 non-chargeable hours on these things because our particular role requires us to take on other responsibilities, such as being a team leader or a partner managing the firm or spending time on marketing, even spending time on learning and keeping up to date. So 2 hours per day isn't a great deal, but some of you will put down non-chargeable time against a will writing job because you've had to research something or you've had to visit someone at home or other things which you just don't think can fit within the target for your fixed fee. And so basically it all starts to build up and you have more non-chargeable time recorded if you record it at all. So if we look at those figures another way, the crude mathematics would be if you need to see 1,333 clients at 2 hours per client, you would actually need 2,666 chargeable hours per year in order to reach your target net profit. So clearly the maths do not work because a single practitioner that had a target of £400,000 of turnover would quite frankly be worked to death to achieve that kind of profit. So what we tend to do is we tend to tone down the net profit margin rather than examine how the variables that create it might be tweaked and might be improved to make it more possible. And also, if we are being totally realistic looking at chargeable hours, then we can only realistically see 600 clients per year if we're taking 2 hours per client. So is there anything we can do to move down from 2 hours per client, yet still keep the quality at the level we need for competence, for security, for safeguarding, and for minimizing of risk in our firm? So it's useful to look at some crude maths. Let's keep on with this idea for a minute. So even 600 clients sounds pretty optimistic. But if we saw only 600 clients at £300 per client, this reduces our turnover from, wait for it, 400,000, which we were trying to achieve, right down to 180,000. Now, this is perhaps more like what you're turning over. And if this happened, then consequently our net profit margin, if we were still trying to achieve 25%, would end up with a net profit of 45,000, not our targeted 100,000. So the question is, can you survive and thrive on that? If you can, that's where you sit, and that's your choice. And so for some of you, that would be acceptable. And I have to say, those sort of figures are in line with the median fee income for private clients in a Law Society market study some years ago. But the point is, those figures are low compared to other areas of practice where we don't necessarily charge the same low fixed rate of fees. And let's be honest, in professional indemnity insurance terms, will writing and probate are the most risky area after conveyancing. So if we're squeezing the amount of time we spend with clients, we do have to make sure we're preserving quality to protect our firm from risk. So let's look at the variables. It seems to me that this is always a good place to start. What generates the profits? Well, one of you will be surprised that the first thing I was going to look at was overheads. Clearly, the income we receive from the work we do is reduced by the expenses of the firm, and what's left is our net profit. So clearly, overheads get allocated to our turnover and reduce our ability to make a profit against sales. So make sure that you do look at the cost of selling. I mean, for example, in our world, there's not a lot we can do about that. The cost of sale is the equipment we use, the paper we use, the ink, etc. So again, to what extent can we make much of a difference? But also, it's the admin costs and the things that really do affect us mostly in law firms, which is our staff overhead, because we are a people business, our professional indemnity insurance, because we're obliged to have it, and our rent. And those three alone probably constitute by far the largest elements of our overhead cost. And then our selling costs, how much money we spend on marketing and advertising. For many people, not a lot, and maybe we do have to think about that. So our overheads, and after all, every firm will be different because the bigger the firm, often the greater the overhead because they're paying staff more for more highly skilled and specialised people sometimes, and also their overhead offices and the running of those fancy glass towers are expensive. So if we charge too much, and a business cannot attract the kind of customers that will pay the fees that are necessary to cover those high overheads, then obviously we will make no profit. And if we charge too little, the profits will also be too low for survival. Now, I know that the first thing firms look at in terms of profit is to reduce overhead to enhance the profit. But the problem is that, like any austerity measures, if you cut too much, then you end up with not enough support for the very people who are there to generate the fees for you. And so you start to erode the quality of work that's being done by the very people you need in order to achieve your turnover. But nevertheless, it's always worth looking at overheads, and just a couple of things. I mean, obviously I said it's difficult to reduce operating costs, but look at the cost of sales. What could you do to reduce equipment and paper costs? Well, maybe go paperless. In the end, the will would have to be printed, but maybe everything else doesn't. Review your supplier base. Again, if you can cut the costs of your overheads, such as your professional indemnity insurance, by collaborating in a group such as LawNet, where the costs of these things might be bought in bulk and enable you to have more clout, so your negotiating skills could be enhanced through the ability to shop around within a bigger market that's helped you to get the costs down. Otherwise, you've probably got to think about diversification. So if we're just talking about selling standard wills at a fixed fee, that might not be enough. We might have to focus on different attractive products which are likely to be of interest to the same clients, so we can double up on the fees, but also it could be that we attract different clients to our services by having a broader range of services. So as you know, many of you, despite lots of organisations bandying around low prices for wills, nevertheless need to think about whether you are actually charging enough for your services. And you do need to review your pricing because, for example, I made the assumption that we don't charge for home visits at all, but it is reasonable to charge for home visits, and you may therefore have a standard fee in your charging fixed fee, which takes on board the fact that a lot of your clients do want you to do a home visit, and therefore you can happily offer it every time on the assumption that you worked out that most of your client catchment was within, say, 15 minutes drive of your office, so that overall you're spending 30 minutes travelling on every case. And that would be included in the fixed fee price, so you could increase the fixed fee price to reflect that, and then make it clear that you're happy to go outside that area if it's practicable, but then there would be an additional charge. So taking on board the costs of home visits might be worthwhile. And are you able to distinguish better, and I'll come back to this later, between the standard will we're talking about and more complex wills? Because clearly then you could move from having just one fixed price, you could have several different price points which reflected the different complexity of the sort of will a person might need. And this enables you to think about, well, if I'm going to do more complex wills and they're going to take more time, then I'll have less hours to do the standard wills, and we don't want to lose business, and we have a lot of standard wills at present. So therefore maybe I can think about employing a paralegal. Let's say the average salary of a paralegal is £20,000 a year, and it might take them longer than you to deal with a standard will. But nevertheless, if it took them 4 hours and they were still charging £300 for the service, then they could perhaps manage 300 wills per annum, which would give a £90,000 of turnover. So a modest contribution to the turnover target of 400,000. But if this left you with time to do more complex wills, where you could take 5 hours rather than 2, because you're doing other things, perhaps estate planning, and you could fully charge your hourly rate rather than a fixed fee, then basically you'd only need 240 of those, and you'd be turning over 312,000. So between you, you would achieve your target of £400,000 of turnover. Now the question is whether you can still keep your overheads down so that the net profit is still 25%. Obviously, with taking on an extra person and member of staff, that might not be possible. But if you were both to do your own typing and you didn't need a secretary, or your secretary became your paralegal, then maybe you could still keep the overheads down. So this is the sort of thing you have to think about, is if we have work we can delegate, and that's the key thing here, then have we got suitably trained people we can delegate to? And do we have enough complex work, which we are capable of handling, in order to make this switch? I know that many of you have done this already, but if you haven't, it's worth considering. Another thing to think about is how we can work smarter. I said that our marketing time is probably limited because we only have 2 hours of non-chargeable time a day. And so we might need to investigate whether we can make our marketing budget and our time spread further. And this can often be done by teaming up with complementary firms or organisations with whom you can pool resources, both your time and your spending, in order to be able to enhance the sort of work you could get. So to get those more complex wills and more of them, then you need to be marketing to people with those greater resources. And that means working with people who usually do deal with well-off people, such as accountants, IFAs, and wealth managers. So my question would be, are you good at collaborating with others? And do you value marketing potential? If you don't, then this is going to be hard for you to get your head round. But some of your non-chargeable time could be very well spent on marketing if you're targeting the right clients that you need more of. And everyone needs incentives. It's useful to look at ways you can incentivize both staff and your customers, clients who already like your service. And so staff, if you thank them, that can sometimes be enough of incentive. But you could also provide a financial incentive, which gives them more money if they were on their base salary, they got a profit or a bonus for the number of clients they saw. What you have to be careful about is not to encourage too much volume at the cost of quality, because there's always a trade-off between quality, quantity, costs and time. So the more you have, then obviously you've got to think about preserving the quality. And customers are also looking for bargains, aren't they? We know that. They shop around. They're looking for loyalty rewards. So if you want them as clients, consider the sort of things that consumers are often given in other areas of life. Discounts, vouchers, loyalty cards, rewards for referrals. These are the sort of things which can be helpful. And so if you're wanting more of something, clearly make sure your incentives are targeted to the right sort of business that you want and that you've fully costed them into your charges. Well, I can almost feel down the line that many of you are saying, well, that's all very well, but there really isn't enough potential business in my geographical area. So I want you then to start thinking about, well, how do I find what there might be, and how do I know that my gut feeling is what it is? So I agree, you do need to look at my crude numbers again from, again, a different perspective. Let's use our figures another way. If we have a turnover of 400,000, of which we need to take out £100,000 of profit, then basically if we can keep our overheads and tax bills to 300,000, then potentially we have our £100,000 of profit. And the number of saleable hours, if we're one partner and one paralegal, is 2,400. So if, therefore, we are looking at that, how does that play into the price and quality conundrum? Well, it means that to achieve our targets, each hour worked by both the partner and the paralegal would have to achieve a blended rate of £167 an hour. Paralegal could achieve £75 an hour, the partner £260 an hour if all their 1,200 hours each are chargeable. But if we were just looking at one person, and let's say it's the partner, charging for their time at the hourly rate, then we would need to charge £333 in order to get our profits and to get the turnover we need. So basically, the question is, how many clients would pay that per hour for a will in your area? So I can see that sometimes blending the rate gives you a better idea of how you need to break down the work between a partner and a paralegal, and how you need to have differential pricing or budgeting within the team in order to be able to achieve a realistic profit target. So this shows that to preserve quality of work, but also achieve our targets on turnover and profit, it definitely pays to have different levels of skill involved so that our pricing can be competitive, that we can differentiate between the paralegal's pricing and what they're doing for the customers in your area on a standard basis, and then for the more complex cases where the person who is senior can be charging more and recovering more. So pricing really is quite incredibly important, because if your decisions on pricing show you that you are significantly higher than the market will pay in your area, then there's really no future unless you do things differently. And that's not to criticize anyone who's recognizing their worth and are getting clients. But the question is, if you're not getting clients, then there's something wrong. Is it your reputation? I hope not. But it could be the pricing, and the pricing we may have to change. Or you have to accept that this isn't the area for you. So if the market around your office is only going to pay £100 for a will, then if your overheads are as we described and you need £400,000 of turnover from your will practice, then the business is doomed to fail on that basis. If there are places in your geographical area which attract people who are willing to pay £300 for a will, you're partly on a winner if the cost of the delivery to them in your area could be at that paralegal level. And it may well be that if you spread your net further beyond your geographical area, and you could actually achieve work from a different location, then basically there could be an untapped market for more complex wills with estate planning attached, in which case your pricing model will fit the bill. So geography can be a factor. And locally, I have to tell you this story really because it's so apposite. We have a high-class jeweller in Winchester who makes jewellery as well as selling off-the-peg jewellery. And he and his wife started their business in Kent, selling much cheaper goods. And they couldn't realise their dream of being able to make jewellery because there wasn't enough market for them in their area. And they realised there was a ceiling to the disposable income available in the area that was determinative of the sort of money people could spend on jewellery. And so they did their homework and they looked at towns and cities in the country where there was a higher net disposable wealth. And they took the plunge by visiting these places and eventually selected Winchester. And frankly, they have never looked back. And they now have a very significant jewellery business in the centre of Winchester. So I make the point that whilst you can sometimes spread the net further, it might only be down the road. If you're not thinking about that, then somebody else might be. And one of the big problems that, or will writing and estate planning and probate also, is that it is potentially lucrative if you can do enough volume. And so it has attracted big players. The cooperative have obviously got a wills and probate service, and that's national. Fair Will is a new character on the block, and they too are national players. In fact, they've both set up their businesses to be national, and they use IT and telephone. And some of the businesses, I mean, I don't know what the co-op's funding is like, but the capital funding that has been talked about for Fairwill is 7.5 million raised by venture capital, and their goal is to disrupt the deaf market. Now, this is very hard for small firms to compete with, but if they are already in existence, and more may follow, then they're eating into your potential market. And it's hard for you on a smaller scale to invest anything like that kind of money in IT. But you could invest in IT on a smaller scale, enabling you to do a higher volume of wills across a larger geographic area if you charged and looked at things with this in mind. So even if you kept my standard figures that we've been using in this example of £300, if you can't get it in your geographical area, could you operate perhaps with a central hub where your low costs of overheads are, because the salaries are less in your area, the rents are lower in your area, but stretch out by having practitioners who work from home in the higher value area and just use your central hub to keep the overheads down. So you've spread yourself across a larger geographical area by using practitioners who could be based in more higher disposable income area and using IT to keep everybody in touch and up to date from your central hub. So you've just got to think about other ways of looking at it to compete. I know some firms are run as virtual firms already, with the back office providing this hub I'm talking about, so that the training and the back office accounts and the PII are all covered from the central administrative resource, and each fee earner is effectively a sole practitioner, and they share their fee income in part to cover the overheads, but they retain the rest. So there's a greater feeling that for that fixed fee to pay the overheads, the rest is your money, and the more you can do, the better your income will be. But these networks can be a useful way of obtaining referrals from different specialists, because some of these firms obviously have a limited number of private client practitioners purposefully, so that there are other specialist services in the same firm, and they can cross-refer, just as you would refer work to them. And so you might get a fee for that, but also you get some work from other fee earners in different geographical area. So you get the geographical spread in that way. So many of you make wills more profitable by looking at the different services that you could add on. Is there a complementary service such as an LPA or estate planning that you can achieve what you're setting out to do? So another way of examining how to achieve your desired net profit is to consider what additional services could be offered, and that especially if they are complementary, using a similar kind of information to create them, then obviously that can be a beautiful add-on service. LPAs fit the bill, and I find it very strange actually that many firms charge significantly more for preparing LPAs than they do for wills. I've often wondered why that is, but I think it's because wills have got so fixed in the minds of regulators and the public at being at a low level that the solicitor just feels it's easier to charge a higher price for something that isn't perhaps examined in the same way, and that basically they'll charge more likely the time that they need for the LPA. But time can mean that the regulators start to look at pricing in other areas too. And so I think you have to be careful, because you want to make sure that you can do the necessary safeguarding and a careful approach. So as we know, it's very important to protect vulnerable people. So over and above the basic client details, you need to spend time on the safeguarding issues. So an LPA needs the same data pretty much as a will, but you need the time to think about the choice of attorneys and replacement attorneys and explain the difference between joint and several and joint, which is often quite time consuming. And obviously the role of certificate provider, making sure that no one is being unduly influenced in the process of making their power of attorney. So those things are where time can go. With property and finance LPAs as well, you're probably wanting to explain to them the sort of safeguarding provisions that could usefully be added in order to make sure that the person managing the money doesn't run off with the money. So this is where summary sheets can be awfully helpful. Also, to have that list of common preferences and instruction clauses ready that can be added as a protection for your clients, and therefore help sheet information which you either have done originally or using the OPG guidelines can be helpful to attorneys as well. So it seems to me that you can invest in a bit of preparation. I'm sure many of you do this already, so that you can minimise the time spent on the property and financial LPAs, at the same time protecting and safeguarding the client. Similarly with health and welfare LPAs, apart from needing again the same data about the individual, the key difference is you need them to think about who should be making decisions about their daily routines, such as washing, dressing and eating, their medical care and where they live. Do they want to make a choice about that? And they may want to spend time with the donee, basically making sure that they understand their role isn't about spending the money, but having to talk to the person with the property and financial affairs power. They might be able to then carry out the services that they're doing. So there might well therefore have to be overlap in getting money for new clothes, hairdressing, decorating, support from the professional or from the person who isn't necessarily a professional but another member of the family, let's say, who is running the financial LPA. And so talking to the client as the donor of these powers about whether the choices need to be the same of the person involved, and also how well the parties would work together if they chose different people. And then, of course, the nutty problem with health and welfare is whether or not they should be refusing or consenting to consent to treatment for the person. So this means explaining to the attorney as well what their role will mean about having to show information to medical practitioners, making sure that care staff know that they have to be involved in the decision-making process, and also basically explaining to attorneys that they can't always make decisions, particularly about medical treatment, because there might already be an advanced decision already made, or there might have been a sectioning of that person, and so it's taken out of your control into the hands of the medical profession. So what I'm getting at here is that taking on LPA preparation can be very useful as an add-on service, as long as you're comfortable with dealing with really rather different questions and also those safeguarding issues. And I know that some firms charge £200 for a will whilst charging £400 for an LPA. Crazy but true. So we have to factor in then, if we're going to add in the service, how much extra time would that take? I think you could probably take 30 minutes to discuss the attorneys, their role and that of the certificate provider, because you have a lot of the other information already. So perhaps you should allow 30 minutes extra for the property and financial affairs LPA, whereas the health and welfare, the focus is probably going to be on managing the emotions of the client over the decision to actually want to appoint someone to make healthcare decisions on their behalf. So let's say another 30 minutes. So for our individual now, whose will we estimated would take 2 hours, we're now adding in 3 hours. And so basically you've got further pieces of work, but the time spent has gone up from 2 hours to 3 hours. And so if you were to charge the same for the will and each of the LPAs, we've now got 3 pieces of work, each being charged at £300. So for 3 hours, we're now getting £900 of fees. And so this is now starting to look like a more profitable service, which I know is why many of you do encourage both of these things at the same time. Fine. So all my assumptions have been based on having a fixed fee of £300 and our additional services coming in at a similar price per item, and that if we are going to move away from a standard fee of £300, it's because we're going to go up and we're going to be charging more for complex wills. But what is the reality? The reality is that regulators and consumer bodies often talk down the cost of a will. For example, I went on to the Money Advice Service website, and this is what they say. They say the cost of drawing up a will by a solicitor varies depending on how complex your affairs are and if the firm is based in a city. So that recognises there are differences depending on the geographical area. But they say a simple will can cost between £144 and £240. So a little bit less than I'm suggesting. And they say so shopping around is important, and you can find somebody good for a lower price and save £100. Well, I still say, even with IT, can you really make a profit and preserve the quality and safeguarding required at £144? They then go on to say a complex will can cost between £150, which is hardly anything more than the simple one they've just quoted, and £300, which is very little variable. It may be more complex as you've been divorced and have children. So yes, they're saying there's like 3 levels. We could have our £300 will, but that would be starting to deal with slightly more complex situations. And actually a family will would have children involved, so maybe that's saying that's okay. So maybe they're looking at a simple will as being for a single person and a complex will being for a family. Even if they both have to pay for each of their mirror wills. And then it goes on to say a specialist will that involves trusts or overseas properties, or you want tax planning advice. Expect to pay a minimum of £500 to £600, according to which. Well, that's looking a bit more like it, but it's not the same as 5 hours of chargeable time at £260 an hour. But it just shows you've got to be able to distinguish between your services. And after all, that's what some of these organisations are suggesting clients shop around for. So that enables you to charge different prices. A mirror will, they say, costs usually less than doing them individually and are worth considering, well, got to be done, if you and a spouse or partner want substantially the same wills. Well, yes, I mean, often many of you will give a discount if you're doing mirror wills. So I thought it would just be useful to put that reality check there. I wonder how many of you are making those distinctions. And even if we don't match exactly what they're suggesting, if you're not already making those simple distinctions, you could significantly improve your profits overnight if you did that tomorrow. So the challenge is distinguishing between simple and complex, as we can see. And so it doesn't really matter whether you call it standard, which I think is perhaps nicer, or simple, but basically you need to be able to say who would fit within your simple or standard fixed fee. And clearly, the more you can have clarity on that, but don't cloud it with lots of detail, then the easier it is for people to understand. I was listening on Tuesday to a behavioral economist talking about how people buy services and looking at it from their behavior rather than just from capitalism, going for the price. And it was very, very interesting because basically she was advising that you lose people if you make the information too complicated. So they just disengage. And that to actually help them make a relevant decision, you do need to present the facts, but as simply as possible. Maybe this is where graphics come into it. Maybe you can do that with photographs, pictures, anything that helps people understand. And then, of course, the areas where you want to charge appropriately and probably charge an hourly rate where you can give an average or an example, and often this helps with price transparency if you can give an example of why it's different, then I've listed a few of the things on the screen. Any and all of those can cause a will drafting exercise to be more expensive. So the key to this is knowing the difference between standard and simple work and the more complex work, and trying to increase your profitability based on what you're delivering. So fundamentally, the cost of your service is the amount you spend on producing it. So as I've tried to show you, your overheads clearly are relevant, and you can introduce a differential cost by having a lower cost person do the work. But at the end of the day, the balance is, will the quality be as good? Yes, it might be if there's still supervision and if there is IT. So effectively, you might have more of the lower cost people. So the fact is, your cost of production is always worth looking at. Secondly, the price that you're charging the client is your financial reward for providing the service. So in other words, there is a difference, so hopefully, between the cost of producing your service and the price you're charging for it. And I know with many of you, the price you're charging for a will is not covering the cost of providing that service. And at the end of the day, none of that matters if the client doesn't think they're getting value for money. But all the regulators, a lot of consumer bodies will say again and again, people don't always go for the cheapest. We always think they do, and then we race to the bottom to compete with a lower price. But actually, people don't. They look at the value. Is this value for money? Have I had a good experience? And therefore, can we ask them whether they enjoyed the experience as best they can? It is, after all, probably a distress purchase. But if they needed it and we made it less painful than previous experiences, and we made it easy for them to engage with us because they liked us, we saw them at home, or we saw them in an informal atmosphere where they felt at ease, these are the sort of things which means, okay, it cost a bit more, but it was value for money. And that's the goal. So, to think about this, what are the points for you to review in your future plan? Well, I would say that the scope of the work needs to have been clearly identified. As we've seen, scoping the work can be quite tricky, and maybe that does need a senior person, or even a marketing person who's not a lawyer, who actually understands what the consumer's trying to do and trying to sell them the right service. Have you put in the relevant caveats about the differences between your standard service, your more complex service, your add-on services? Have we identified why you can't stick within one price but have become in another price? And basically, has the urgency of the matter been taken into account? You only have to look at other professions to see what's happened over time as their monopolies have been eroded. Some years ago, when what was then the Monopolies Commission, that's really what we call the Competition and Markets Authority today, looked at professions back in Margaret Thatcher's day, and opticians were targeted. And as a result, their right to be the prescriber of your prescription for glasses was taken away. And this opened up the market for other providers who could then provide you the product, the glasses, at a cheaper price if necessary. And you've seen what's happened to the glasses market. We've got a consolidation around two very big providers who are doing things in their own way. So Specsavers was all about producing glasses cheaper, and they flooded the market with cheaper spectacles, even though the prescription glass was still there, but the frames were cheaper, they were made in different countries, and it was about the price point, and it was all in the name. By the same contrast, you have Vision Express, whose distinguishing feature was to say, well, yes, we can do your service, but we will charge more for doing it quickly. And we will offer an express service, but the price reflects that. And so the name tells you all. It's Vision Express, and the price reflects the express. And then there are the traditional high street opticians, which have grown less and less in number, and they take up less than 25% of the market now. So really, I'm trying to say to you that you have to think about having differential prices and not being afraid to say, well, you're going on holiday next week and you've only come in today and you want me to do this. Of course, I'm willing to do it for you, but I'm going to have to drop other things, and that's going to mean I have to charge you a bit more. And has the financial value of the matter been reflected in the quote? If you're not taking on board the complexity of someone's affairs and whether they need advice on how business property relief or something like that applies to their affairs, and they could therefore make bad choices simply because they're ill-informed, and even though the will might be simple and may look like your standard will, nevertheless the advice was significant and it took you longer. And this is something that you need to reflect in your quote. And have you thought of innovative ways of quoting? I don't think we tend to offer people payment by instalments for lower value standard wills, but we certainly should offer people the ability to pay by credit card, shouldn't we? And also to pay by transfer of funds. And obviously we could think on the more complex cases of a retainer for 3 months while they pay something each month in order to be able to spread the cost. In other words, be a bit more creative about how you could actually get paid. And as I've mentioned, think about how you resource delivering the service. Could it be with different types of people working for you? Could it be with IT that you pay for as you go? Have you looked into what's on the market to do things digitally? So the thing is, if you're not doing that, if you're not thinking about what you will do next, then think about those big firms coming into the marketplace. Think about what's happened to opticians. And one of the odd things about modern capitalism, which was mentioned in the Times not so long ago, is that we think it all comes from selling the things that they make, but really it rarely is. He gave the example of McDonald's, who doesn't make money from selling burgers and fizzy drinks. That's interesting, isn't it? Think of the price point for those and how many they would have to sell to make a profit. How it makes its profit is from buying sites and leasing them to franchisees. In other words, the company is really a property company, and it makes a turn on letting out the property. And it's one of the world's biggest property owners. Equally, he highlights Coca-Cola, and they don't earn their profits by bottling and selling Coke, but by selling the right to make it to others. So in other words, they don't have many physical assets. And that's how it is for leading companies. Apple, for instance, doesn't make a single phone itself, it just designs them. So can you work with other organizations in order to be able to help things along? Modern airlines don't own their planes, they lease them. That's what's happened with law firms. We don't own our offices anymore, we lease them. But we've still got to try and make a profit from the businesses we sell. The chief asset, apparently, of the rescued airline Flybe, which is the airline that I used to use a lot, wasn't its planes, but its landing slots at Heathrow. So, someone might come along and buy your business if you've done your best to make things streamlined and profitable, and your offices are in great locations for the services that need to be sold. So does that give you some idea about thinking differently about your business? And finally, just to show you that we can't do nothing, is that Legal Futures had an article the other day on its website about an app that's been developed with European funding and the support of Westminster University. And this is to help small business owners diagnose and get guidance on their legal problems. And they're going to have a consumer version soon. And this is to enable a person to, for a free or small fee per month, access data about a problem, so they can use the app to ascertain what their problem is and then research it. And if they decide they've got enough information, they don't need a lawyer. Whereas if they decide it's too complicated and they need a lawyer, at least now they know what their problem is to ask about and the sort of lawyer to find. So I think these kind of things are going to grow, and certainly what the Competition and Markets Authority might do next is encourage a price comparison website. There are some already in existence. So you can keep up to date with my publications. You can remember to subscribe to the monthly digest for your hardcore law. But obviously I hope today has been helpful, and I'm going to hand you back to Mark to see if there's any questions before we wind up.
Thank you very much, Gill. Yeah, we have a number of questions. So first off, we have Nicholas Fluck from Stapleton's has asked, in our area, the tariff for will pricing is set by a local, unqualified and unregulated will writer. All of the charge-out rates you quote are wildly above levels at which a non-sophisticated client would buy a will here. Any legal suggestions for differentiation?
Yes, thank you. This will often be the case. The unregulated are often cheaper, and we differentiate ourselves by explaining to the public, because, by the way, they don't understand that regulation is important and insurance is important. So this is why the SRA have developed the logo for us to use on our websites, which gives the client a link to the regulatory framework. Now, I'm not suggesting we want clients to understand the very complex regulatory framework, but they want the assurance that people are regulated. And there's been plenty of research recently done for the Law Society and others which demonstrates the general public is lacking in education about these things. And when you explain properly to them what regulation means, that you are competent and insured, then they will say, that's what I want, and I appreciate I have to pay more for it. So I'm afraid it comes down to confidence, and there isn't a tariff for will writing. It's what you can distinguish yourselves on, but please don't forget that regulation and insurance and competence are something that clients or potential clients take for granted and don't understand. Now, I mentioned earlier about geography, and I do understand that in some areas there'll be a lot of unemployment. There will not be money willing to be spent on will writing, and one has to say, then you have to look quite critically at whether you can afford to offer that service, don't you? And that's tragic, because we're driving people then to the unregulated and uninsured. So I think it's worth the effort to try and think of ways to try and make it possible by changing the way you offer the service, in order to be able to achieve a reasonable fee from what you do by distinguishing yourself from the competition.
Okay, lovely. Another question from Michael Downey at JCP Solicitors. Does making an H&W LPA override a previous advance directive?
Well, that's a really good question. It's not really what the subject of the talk is, but it's a good question. They can be complementary. You don't have to remove one by the other, but you do have to be careful when you're drafting health and welfare LPA that you don't revoke the advance directive. Don't forget, the advance directive is saying, I've made my choice, and this is what I want to happen when I'm no longer able to make choices freely. What the health and welfare is doing is saying, I'm not made a choice, I'm delegating this person to make a choice for me. So they're not necessarily incompatible.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Anthony Kalp from Berry and Lamberts. Should the preparation of a detailed attendance note be chargeable to the client, particularly if the will is likely to be challenged after death?
Well, the attendance note is fundamental these days to our own risk. So effectively, if we don't do a detailed attendance note, then we are leaving ourselves open to risk in every case. It's therefore important that we record our attendance on the client. That is not something that you're charging for separately. It's part of the service and has to be factored in, hence my using an assumption of 2 hours' time. It's not just the face-to-face meetings, it's the time it takes you to keep your records and to be able to draft using precedents. So, yes, of course you must have your attendance note, but you don't charge separately for it necessarily. What you're doing is factoring that in to the cost of your service. And yes, if you haven't got attendance notes, the case law is long and horrible over what happens to poor solicitors who can't say what they did in a particular case should what they did be challenged.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. We do have many other questions which Gill will endeavour to answer going forward. The next date for your diaries, and obviously coming up very quickly, is the next Certainty Expert webinar hosted by Mark Salon of Wilmington PLC and Rita Leet of Institute of Paralegals. That will be the 31st of March. As a last piece, we are all professionals here today. Do take a minute to join the Certainty National Will Register group on LinkedIn for pertinent updates about the services we provide for you and industry updates. Thank you and goodbye from all of us at Certainty the National Will Register.